We're at the end, folks. We have been on a long journey through what we call the Old Testament or the Old Covenant. It's the story of Israel, right? It's the Hebrew scriptures. We started that about the beginning of 2023. We've taken a few breaks along the way, but largely for the past year and 3 quarters, we've been going through the stories of the Old Testament. And we finally come to the end. Now, when I say come to the end, I mean the Old Testament as it's in our Bible is not laid out chronologically. It's laid out in categories. But as the narrative goes, the last story of the Old Testament would have been Nehemiah last week and then part of Ezra the week before. But before those events took place is today's story, and we wanted to finish with it because it's a great way to finish. And so I hope that you'll hang with us as we get into the book of Esther. Esther is our final story to tell. And I do love this one so much. I want to say this to you about it. There's a lot of details in this one that you're like, woo, here we go. But I do hope that you will just bear with us as we jump into a lot of narrative that's going to take us this week and next week. We'll take 2 weeks to tell the story of Esther. And by the time we're done with next Sunday, we'll be finished with this journey we've been on. You ready? Let us jump on in to Esther chapter 1, beginning with verse 1. It says, these events happened in the days of King Xerxes, who reigned over 127 provinces stretching from India to Ethiopia. Now, some of your Bible translations might say King Ahasuerus, okay? If that's what your Bible says and you're confused, is it Ahasuerus or Xerxes? The answer is yes, okay? I don't know why the Hebrew, that Ahasuerus is the correct translation from Hebrew. That's the word in Hebrew. But there is no King Ahasuerus we have pretty good Persian records from history. There's no King Ahasuerus ever. But you can see where it can be translated from there to Hebrew to English, differently. So it's the same person. Xerxes, you need to know this. It's not part of our story, but it will help you appreciate our story. Xerxes he's not exactly the best king that ever reigns over Persia. When the Persian Empire comes on the scene, you have King Cyrus the Great. A couple generations later, you have King Darius the Great. Those 2 guys, Cyrus and Darius, history says they were great rulers. History is not so kind to Xerxes. Xerxes tries to take over and expand the kingdom by attacking part of the Greek Empire in the Mediterranean, and he fails. In fact, you know the famous story of the 300. There's a movie about the 300. That's a lot takes place against Xerxes and his failed campaign to go further in the Mediterranean. Xerxes is, he not only fails to expand the kingdom and suffers some defeats, but he also is not a very good moral man. He's a womanizer. And you'll see he's a womanizer in today's story, but that's the tip of the iceberg. I was telling Nathan, because he's starting a book that Anthony and I read through, I was telling him about some things we read about Xerxes recently that I don't have time to tell you, but ask one of us later. The guy has a womanizer problem, big time. And you'll see a little bit of that today. On top of that, he was a lavish spender. He spent money like crazy on stuff for himself, on new houses and palaces, on parties that the kingdom could ill afford. So because of his failures militarily, his womanizing, his spending, the kingdom is weakening underneath him. Now, don't take that wrong. He is still a force to be reckoned with because Persia was strong. But he is beginning the downturn of the dynasty that a couple generations later will give way to the Greeks and Alexander the Great. But right now they're still powerful, even though Xerxes is not the best king on the books. Anyhow, it says in verse 2, at that time, Xerxes ruled his empire from his royal throne at the fortress of Susa. Now, it says at that time, referring to at the time of today's story. So today's story takes place at this time where he's at Susa. Now, there are several different palaces that the Persian kings ruled from. Susa was just one of them. Actually, Susa was considered their winter palace because it was a very hot climate area, so they could go to this place certain times of the year especially, and not so much at other times, kind of like snowbirds do, right? Like snowbirds can do, right? And as all snowbirds know, you might go to a certain place for half the year, or only a quarter of the year, or for 3/4 of the year. You have flexibility there, right? So he goes for different lengths of time to Susa or to other palaces. And at the time of today's story, he is in Susa. It says in verse 3 that in the 3rd year of his reign, he gave a banquet for all his nobles and his officials. He invited all the military officers of Persia and Media, as well as the princes and nobles of the provinces. Now, Xerxes is actually the second one in line by birth order from his father, but because of his royal blood back through his mother's side through Cyrus, he became the king at the age of 35. So he's in his 30s still when the story takes place. He is throwing a party. It seems to be that the party takes place after they suffered a humiliating defeat in the Mediterranean, as I mentioned earlier. And now he's back trying to throw a party in order to showcase confidence. Like, hey, we're fine. Okay, we lost, but look how awesome things are. The party's going to show off that we're okay. Verse 4 says the celebration lasted 180 days. It was a tremendous display of the opulent wealth of his empire and the pomp and splendor of his majesty. So, this party's going on. It's long, and it's, do the math. 180 days is a half a year. Who throws a half-year-long party? Okay, we want to ask you the longest party you've ever thrown, but I'll bet you it comes a little short of a half year. 180 days, that means the reason you throw a party that long is because you want everyone to come. You want your military leaders and officials to come from all over the kingdom, but they can't come all at once or the kingdom's going to be depleted of its leadership. So it's kind of a come and go. Come more than once, stay as long as you want for a half a year. And it's decadent and it's stupid, but so is Xerxes. Verse 9 says, at the same time, Queen Vashti gave a banquet for the women in the royal palace of Xerxes. Notice this, Queen Vashti. Xerxes has many women. He has lots of women, wives and mistresses. I said earlier he's a womanizer. Can I just make an observation for you to think about? All the kings in those days had lots of wives and mistresses, including some of the Jewish kings we read about the last half a year or so. Lots of wives and mistresses. So if you are called a womanizer amongst that group, you must have been pretty bad, okay? But amongst his many wives, the queen is the one who stood out the most. She would be given a political position. The title of queen amongst his wives was the one who has political position and power. Not near the power of King Xerxes, but enough power to do some things locally. He probably has several queens in the various palaces from which he rules. History shows there's other women that are significant elsewhere in the Persian Empire. But at Susa, Vashti is the queen here, and she has political power here under Xerxes. She's the most significant of his wives. But she's throwing her own party because her and the girls don't want to be at the guys' party because they're drunk and they're raucous. And let's be honest, there are other girls over there, no doubt, scantily clothed and serving drinks and God knows what else. And so they don't want to be a part of that nasty scene. So they're having their own party, her and the ladies, in their own part of the palace during this long time. Well, at some point, Xerxes is like, guys, these girls, they're great, but have you seen my wife, the queen? Oh, tell Vashti to come over here and I want to show her off. I want to show her off. Now, verse 11 says this, he wanted the nobles and all the other men to gaze on her beauty, for she was a very beautiful woman. In other words, the reason she was the queen of all the other wives was not just because she had a great personality. He wanted to bring her in and show her off because she was, she would want. The implication was he wanted her to come in scantily clothed. He wanted her to come in and be objectified and showcased in front of all his drunk, raucous party friends. And she's like, Maybe other girls would be in there because they have no choice, or because they need the money and you're offering money, or because they're trying to get attention to have opportunity to move up or something. But she's already at the top of the game. She's the queen. She's not going to stoop down and go and be objectified in front of the king and his drunk buddies. So she's like, no, I'm not going. And that just makes him mad. So sometime the next day or whatever, he gets together with his buddies to talk about, what should I do about my disrespectful wife? And as the guys are getting together, having a conversation with each other, the good old boys, about what they should do about this woman who wouldn't listen to him, one of the guys speaks up in verse 16. It's Memucan. And Memucan answered the king and his nobles, Queen Vashti has wronged not only the king, but also every noble and citizen throughout your empire. How has she wronged the king? Because she wouldn't go in and be objectified by him and his buddies? He was wronging her by asking her to come. But now he's saying she's wronged not only the king, but everyone in the whole empire. Like, hyperbole much? Like, this sounds like politics today, and half of us, people on social media, you know. The people who I don't agree with on something are not just wrong. They're evil and trying to destroy our nation and everything. We always like to exaggerate how bad the things are that we don't like. It's just pathetic, really. But anyhow, that's humans for you. But now this guy's going to be like, oh, she's not only wronged us, she's wronged the whole empire. Oh, okay. How? How has she done that? Verse 17. He says, women everywhere will begin to despise their husbands when they learn that Queen Vashti has refused to appear before the king. Before this day is out, the wives of all the king's nobles throughout Persia and Media will hear what the queen did and will start treating their husbands the same way. What way? Refusing to come in front of their husbands and their drunken buddies and show themselves off? Good. It says there will be no end to their contempt and anger. And so here's their advice. So if it please the king, we suggest, the good old boys club, we suggest that you issue a written decree, a law of the Persians and Medes that cannot be revoked. Remember, there was a way that passed laws in that empire. We mentioned this back in Daniel's story, that the king's signet could seal, that if the law was passed that way, the king himself could not reverse the law. And so, yeah, I'll take a new one. Bring it down to me if you don't mind, somebody. Anyhow, so basically he says, pass the law, king, that cannot be revoked. What's the law that you're going to pass? It should order that Queen Vashti be forever banished from the presence of King Xerxes, and the king should choose another queen who is more worthy than she. Isn't that interesting? Now, folks, the fact that this is an irrevocable law is pretty crazy. Can I just say this to you before I shift gears here? There's something to think about while technical difficulties are being fixed here. Just think about this. They convinced him to make this decision when he was emotionally upset at her in a way that's irrevocable. I want to say this to all of us away from the story today. Be careful about the people who try to convince you to make decisions when you are in a bad frame of mind or frustrated frame of mind that you cannot easily undo. Maybe you're grieving, maybe you're angry, maybe you're depressed, maybe you're frustrated, maybe you're fearful. Be careful of the people that come along and try to convince you to do things in the moment that later on you probably, once you calm down or things shift, you might regret, but they convince you to do things that are hard to fix later, are irrevocable. It's always dangerous, isn't it? Yeah, those aren't friends. But they're convincing the king to do something that he's later going to want to change his mind about. But too bad. So they said, hey, king, make an irreversible law that she cannot that we're going to banish. But think about this poor girl. We're going to not just demote her from queen, we're going to banish her from the land forever. From the queen, from the royal, from the family. Actually, it might be a blessing in disguise, who knows. But anyhow, they're going to kick her out. When this decree is published, the guy continues, when this decree is published throughout the king's vast empire, husbands everywhere, whatever their rank, will receive proper respect from their wives. These guys have a good conversation going here, right? It says in verse 21, this is so funny, the king and his nobles thought this made good sense. Like, yeah, that's what we should do. All in favor, all the men in the room in favor of passing this law to tell the women to know their place, say aye. Aye. Opposed? And it's carried, you know. I mean, so it makes good sense to us. So he followed Memucan's counsel. He sent letters to all parts of the empire, to each province in its own script and language, proclaiming that every man should be the ruler of his own home and should say whatever he pleases. How are we doing, girls? This is great. Men, guys, we should be low-key embarrassed, secondhand embarrassment from this. This is cringy, right? But this is what happened in the world of King Xerxes that we just read about. Well, he leaves Susa. He goes on some more military campaigns, or maybe he goes to a different palace. Sometime later, he comes back to Susa, and guess who's not queen anymore? And guess who he misses? But his buddies convince him to make an irrevocable decision that he's got to live with now. So chapter 2 and verse 1 says, but after Xerxes' anger had subsided, he began thinking about Vashti and what she had done and the decree he had made. What do you do now when he's all missing her? I miss that gal. So his personal attendant suggested, let us search the empire to find beautiful young virgins for the king. That's just what he needs, more women in his harem. That will solve everything right there, right? So they're going to go on a campaign to get a bunch of beautiful, young virgins who aren't married off yet. I mean, don't even think about the implications of all of this, to bring into his harem for his pleasure. This person who's making the suggestion continues in verse 3, let the king appoint agents in each province to bring these beautiful young women into the royal harem at the fortress of Susa. Haggai, the king's eunuch in charge of the harem, will see that they are all given beauty treatments. So the king has eunuchs in different places because they're not threatening to anybody, to take care of the harem, to keep an eye on things. And this guy's job is just to give them beauty treatments so that they'll look fabulous, right? After that, the young woman who most pleases the king, will be made queen instead of Vashti. So these girls are brought in, never to have a life of their own anymore, to marry, find love, start a family, but to be part of the harem. And the one with a winning lottery ticket, the one who gives the king the most pleasure, with a winning lottery ticket gets to be queen, with all the perks and problems that come with that, as we just saw a moment ago. Well, guess what? This advice was very appealing to the king. I'll bet it was. So he put the plan into effect. Well, that's where we need to start meeting some of our other characters for today's story. Esther chapter 2, verse 5 says, at that time there was a Jewish man in the fortress of Susa whose name was Mordecai, son of Jair. Now, we're going to meet Mordecai today, and he'll be important also next week as well. Mordecai is a Jewish man who lives there because Jews were scattered since the captivity all over the place. Some went back home when the captivities ended. Some stayed where they were. Mordecai is in Susa. In verse 7, it tells us that the man had a very beautiful and lovely cousin, young cousin, Hadassah, who was also called Esther. Remember, many Jewish people had a Hebrew name and a local name for wherever they lived. So Hadassah was known as Esther locally. And she was this man's young cousin, so he's kind of like an uncle to her. When her father and mother died, Mordecai adopted her into his family, and he raised her as his own daughter. The implication might be that he had his own family, and she became part of it as one of his kids, or whatever. Maybe he's the only one. It's unclear. But basically, he becomes Uncle Ben to Peter Parker, right? He becomes the man who raises her as his own child when her parents die. Well, you know where this is going, don't you? Let's get to it. Verse 8. As a result of the king's decree, Esther, along with many other young women, was brought to the king's harem at the fortress of Susa and was placed in Haggai, the eunuch's care. Haggai was very impressed with Esther, and he treated her kindly. He quickly ordered a special menu for her and provided her with beauty treatments. He also assigned her 7 maids, specially chosen from the king's palace, and he moved her and her maids into the best place in the harem. So in other words, Haggai is like, this girl stands out. And I think she might be the one, but who knows what the king will decide. So he gives her preferential treatment. And I don't know if that makes a weird vibe with her and the other girls, or if anyone even wanted to be there in the first place, but I don't know. But she's obviously the front runner in this person's mind. Verse 10 tells us that Esther had not told anyone of her nationality and family background because Mordecai had directed her not to do so. Now, I don't know why. I don't know what made him decide to, keep this detail back, but maybe it was anti-Semitism going on, but for some reason she keeps her nationality private. And it says that every day Mordecai would take a walk near the courtyard of the harem to find out about Esther and what was happening to her. He's lingering around. He wants to know if she's okay because he cares about her. And he knows she's in a tough spot. I mean, life has changed for her forever. Now, if you're reading the story with me right now and you're thinking to yourself, Arlen, you're ruining Esther. I've always liked Esther. It's a Sunday school story. It always felt like a Disney princess story with the Disney castle and palace. And then the girl comes in from lowly start, and the knight in shining armor, and the prince marries her, and she becomes the queen. And that's how I saw the story, and you're just like ruining it. It sounds so terrible about Xerxes and all these girls. It's ruining the story. Good. I'm doing my job. But if I've not done a good enough job of that, let me further do so for you in the next few verses. I almost skipped these, but I wanted to make the point plain. Verse 12 says, before each young woman was taken to the king's bed, she was given the prescribed 12 months of beauty treatments. 6 months with oil of myrrh, followed by 6 months with special perfumes and ointments. Anyhow, I won't leave that alone. 12 months of beauty treatments to get ready to see the king for his one-night tryst. Anyhow, when it was her time to go to the king's palace, she was given her choice of whatever clothing or jewelry she wanted to take from the harem. She could put on all the bling and jewelry she wanted to try to bring any props she wanted to bring to impress the king. And maybe it won't just be a one-time thing. Maybe it'll be an opportunity to be the queen, I guess. That evening, she was taken to the king's private rooms, ... And the next morning, she was brought to the second harem, where the king's wives lived. There she would be under the care of Shashgaz, the king's eunuch in charge of the concubines. So there's another eunuch, another non-threatening man in charge of those women, who are now the king's wives because they've been with the king overnight. And she would never go to the king again. She's just over there. She would never go to the king again unless he had especially enjoyed her and requested her by name. Unless he says, whatever happened to bachelorette number 378? Unless he did that, she's just in the harem. She's never going to be married to somebody else. She's never going to start her own family, have her own kids, have her own life. She is now one of the many wives in the harem. And someone might try to justify and say, well, for some of these girls in poverty, this was a step up from the hard life they may have lived. Sure, maybe. But I think you're over sugarcoating the craziness that they would be basically pampered prisoners forever. Had they managed to get kids from the king, they'd be taken away from them and raised by somebody else, and they'd stay in the harem. It's not exactly a dream deal. And of course, one would be chosen potentially to be queen, which, as Vashti taught us, doesn't always turn out great either. Well, this takes a few years. It was year 3 of the king's reign when he got rid of Vashti. He goes and comes. It takes a lot of time for these girls to get their year-long beauty treatments, to see the king once every so often while he is ready for them. And so a couple years or so go by. At some point, it's Esther's turn. And the eunuch that's helping her really likes her and says to her, Esther, here's my advice. You don't need to bring in a lot of jewelry or a lot of props to impress the king. You're so sharp, just go in as who you are, and just your own self is enough. And so she takes his advice. In verse 16, Esther was taken to King Xerxes at the royal palace in the early winter of the 7th year of his reign. This is 4 years now after Vashti was disposed. 4 years have passed by the time they get to Esther. And the king loved Esther more than any of the other young women. He was so delighted with her that he set the royal crown on her head and declared her queen instead of Vashti. To celebrate the occasion, he gave a great banquet in Esther's honor for all his nobles and officials, declaring a public holiday and giving generous for all the provinces and giving generous gifts to everyone. This has been a whirlwind of a few years for this girl. Some time ago, she lost her parents. Her uncle raises her. She's off to the side now, being in a harem. The Black Hawk helicopters were flying overhead. She was placed in the care of a eunuch. She's a part of a harem. She's dreading this day that comes, and now she's the queen of Susa in the Persian Empire. Well, Mordecai, one of the first things she does is she promotes Mordecai from just being someone lives there to being someone who had an important job near her. She didn't want anyone to know of their connection for reasons that will pay off later. But she wants them to be close by, so she gives them a position in the palace proper. And that way, she has access to him. She has personal attendants who she trusted, who would relay messages back and forth to Mordecai, and he still guided her life like a father, so she gave him a position to do so. Verse 21 says, one day as Mordecai was on duty at the king's gate, two of the king's eunuchs, boy, the king has a lot of eunuchs around, doesn't he? The two of the king's eunuchs, Bigthana and Teresh, who were guards at the door of the king's private quarters, became angry at King Xerxes and plotted to assassinate him. I can't imagine any reason they would be angry at King Xerxes. Anyhow, they plotted to assassinate him. But Mordecai heard about the plot, and he gave the information to Queen Esther. She then told the king about it, and she gave Mordecai credit for the report. So the king hears about it through Esther in Mordecai's name. When an investigation was made and Mordecai's story was found to be true, the two men were impaled on a sharpened pole. Yikes. It's like a terrible form of torture. It's not the first time they've been mutilated, obviously, but still a terrible form of execution that you would do to only your worst enemies to try to stop anyone from wanting to assassinate the king. Like if you try to kill the king, you die a terrible death. And this was all recorded in the book of the history of King Xerxes' reign. And now it's time to meet our last new character today to set up for next week's wild story. Our last new character today. Ready? Esther 3 verse 1 says, sometime later, King Xerxes promoted Haman, son of Hammedatha, the Agagite, over all the other nobles, making him the most powerful official in the empire. There were always people who were trying to rise through the ranks of power, getting noticed because of their abilities to lead or govern, sharp people. And Haman was one of them, and he got close enough to the king for the king to notice him, and the king just liked him. They became friends. In fact, they most likely became drinking buddies. So Haman is promoted to second most powerful man, either in all the empire, as it semi-implies here, or in context of the story, at least second most powerful in this region of the empire of Susa. But Haman's got some real clout with King Xerxes. But he's not a good person. He's ambitious man climbing the ranks of power, but he's not a good man. Most of the time, people who are desperate for positions of power, so many times there's corruption there. Isn't that true? Look at politics today. Almost anybody today, you always worry about people who want to be in power. You're like, why? It's a breeding ground for bad people to want to control and be ambitious. We can go on a whole tangent about that, couldn't we? But anyhow, Haman has made it to near the top, as high as it's going to get for him. But he's not a good person. Verse 2 tells us that all the king's officials would bow down before Haman to show him respect whenever he passed by, for so the king had commanded. How awkward is that? Oh, here's Haman, okay. Bow, bow, bow. But Mordecai refused to bow down or show him respect. Maybe because of his religion. Maybe because he just didn't like Haman. He's like, I ain't bowing down to that jerk. But he ain't doing it. The problem with Mordecai not bowing down is Mordecai was not some random plebe somewhere. He was in a position that Esther secured for him, invisible by the royal facilities. So people notice when he's not bowing down, and of course the gossip spreads, and buttering up type people tell Haman, guess who's not bowing down? And so he notices. And in verse 5, when Haman saw that Mordecai would not bow down or show him respect, he was filled with rage. How dare someone not bow down to me? Let me ask you a question. I want a show of hands. If you want to be honest, it's okay. I won't judge you too hard. How many of you would like for everyone to bow down to you everywhere you go? Would that make you happy? That's weird. But he is so angry that someone won't bow down to him that he's filled with rage. He had learned of Mordecai's nationality, So he decided that it was not enough to lay hands on Mordecai alone. Instead, he looked for a way to destroy all the Jews throughout the entire empire of Xerxes. His plot was this: I don't just want to kill this guy, I want to kill everyone he loves and cares about. I want to wipe out a whole nationality of people just to hurt him worse. So he gets together with his buddies and they put a plan together to pick a future date that they would decree as a day to kill all the Jews, so that all of them can dread this execution date that's looming ever closer to them. And Mordecai can dread it too and feel responsible for everyone else's death, because that will really torture him. And then I'll kill them all because he would not dare bow down to me. That makes sense. So they decide to cast lots. Now that word casting lots is in the Bible sometimes. I've tried to study it, and there's always a few different takes on what it meant, and experts. Actually, casting lots means this. Bottom line is it's kind of confusing, but it's basically a way of trying to divine something, or a game of chance of sorts, like rolling the dice, so to speak. And they use these dice of sorts to figure out what random date in the future would be the execution date for all the Jews. When they picked a date, Haman went to King Xerxes and said, "Hey, king, hey, Haman, hey, listen, there's a group of troublemakers in your kingdom." He doesn't tell them who they are, doesn't say their nationality, just as there's a group of troublemakers, and I have doing my job real carefully. I've been noticing them. They're trouble for you, and they're going to cause problems, and we don't want civil unrest. So if you let me take care of the problem, don't you worry about it, king. You got parties to throw, and buildings to enjoy, and women to enjoy, and military conquest to consider. Let me take care of this problem for you, because I'm looking out for you. I'll get rid of them all. Just give me the authority to pass a law to deal with these problem people. And the king is like, "Oh, Haman, that's what I love about you, man. Always looking out for me. You got it, pal. Hey, drinks later, knuckles, And so they go their separate ways. All because the guy wouldn't bow down to him. So he sets it in motion. In chapter 3, verse 13, it says that dispatches were sent by swift messengers into all the provinces of the empire, giving order that all Jews, young and old, including women and children, must be killed, slaughtered, and annihilated on a single day. This was scheduled to happen on March 7th of the next year. By the way, I didn't mention this to you. This story is going to become a national holiday to this day for Jewish people because of what happens. But let's get into that later. It's scheduled for March the 7th of the next year. Now, how do you get people to participate in a mass genocide? I mean, hasn't history taught us that when people try to exterminate a group of people, there's always good Samaritans who hide the people to protect them from getting killed? How are you going to actually get rid of all the Jewish people in one moment when other people are going to probably try to protect them? You got to find a way to incentivize people to help you kill all the Jews. How does he do that? Well, here's how. Ready? The property of the Jews would be given to those who killed them. So if you kill the Jew, you get their property. You get their clothes, you get their jewelry, you get their money, you get their house. Incentivize greed in people. And now we'll get the job done. Haman's clever and wicked. Chapter 4, verse 1 tells us, when Mordecai learned about all that had been done, he tore his clothes, put on burlap and ashes, and went out into the city, crying with a loud and bitter wail, because not only is his death date getting closer every ticking day, but also all the Jewish people, and he knows it's because of him. It's not his fault, it's Haman's fault, but it's because it's about him. And he feels the heaviness of responsibility. He went as far as the gate of the palace, for no one was allowed to enter the palace gate while wearing clothes of mourning. It's a happy place, right? And as news of the king's decree reached all the provinces, there was great mourning among the Jews. They fasted, wept, and wailed, and many people lay in burlap and ashes, as you can imagine. And of course, Esther, word gets back to Queen Esther that Mordecai, who she cares about, is out there making, tore his clothes and wailing, and he's going to get himself killed. He's in a dangerous spot doing that kind of stuff. So she quickly sends her trusted attendants, one named Hathash, to go out and bring him a change of clothes and say, put these clothes on and pull yourself together, man, and tell me what's going on. Verse 8 says that Mordecai gave Hathach a copy of the decree that was issued in Susa that called for the death of all Jews. He asked Hathach to show it to Esther and explain the situation to her. He also asked Hathach to direct her to go to the king to beg for mercy and plead for her people. Again, she's not revealed that she was Jewish, but he says it's time to come out of the shadows and let people know that we're in trouble and beg for our lives. But there's a problem there, isn't there? And she explains in verse number 10, then Esther told Hathach to go back and relay this message to Mordecai. She said, hey, all the king's officials and even the people in the provinces know that anyone who appears before the king in his inner court without being invited is doomed to die unless the king holds out his gold scepter. If you go into the king's courtyard, inner court, and you are invited, they assume you're there for nefarious reasons. They'll kill you right then and there. The only chance you have of living is if the king says, who's interrupting me? All right, here's my scepter. Spare them. Not likely. And you might be thinking, yeah, but she's the queen, so it'll be no problem for her, right? Not exactly. She goes on to say this. She says, and the king has not called for me to come to him for 30 days. Like the king has lost interest in me temporarily at least. Maybe he's with another wife or mistress, having another shindig going on. But he is not interested in me, so I am not invited. I just can't, as the queen, go usurp my will over the king. Ask Vashti earlier how that turns out. If I walk in there, I'm a dead woman. I can't go talk to him unless he calls for me, and he hasn't bothered to do that. In verse 13, Mordecai sent this reply to Esther. Don't think for a moment that because you're in the palace, you will escape while all the other Jews are killed. Like, don't think that you're going to get out of this whole mess by trying to fly under the radar. He says, if you keep quiet at a time like this, deliverance and relief for the Jews will arise from some other place, but you and your relatives will die. That's very interesting. He's basically explaining to her that God, yes, good people die all the time at the hands of bad people. Stuff happens. But God's not going to let a whole race of people get wiped out without God intervening. He doesn't say God here. God's never mentioned here. But he says, that won't happen. There will be another form of deliverance, another form of relief that will come. But if you don't do the right thing where you are, it won't go well for you and your relatives. And basically that means Mordecai too. Mordecai's saying, I'm dead either way. If the Jews all die, they're after me in the first place. If God saves them, but you do the wrong thing and you and your relatives die, that's also me. I'm dead, man. But you have got to do the right thing. And then he makes a powerful statement. He says, who knows? Who knows if perhaps you were made queen for just such a time as this? Who knows, Esther, if all the crazy stuff that's happened to you, who knows if the death of your parents, raised in my home, being found in Susa with me, being taken by the people and put in the harem, as scary as that was, being chosen amongst all the women to be the queen. Who knows if every bit of your life has happened by divine providence to put you in this exact place for this very reason that God saw coming. Again, God's never mentioned, but he says, who knows if all of this is happening for a reason, for such a time as this. Esther knew he's right. She knew he was right. So then Esther sent this reply to Mordecai. Go and gather together all the Jews of Susa and fast for me. Do not eat or drink for 3 days, or night or day. My maids and I will do the same. And then, though it is against the law, I will go in to see the king. If I must die, I must die. Here's what she's saying. I believe it's the right thing to do. I believe that someone needs to do something. It might not go well, but I believe it's the right thing to do. Do I think I'll live? I doubt it. I have my doubts that it's going to work out very well for me. But though I have those doubts, I believe it's the right thing to do, so I will do it. And if I must die, I must die. So pray for me. So Mordecai went away and did everything as Esther had ordered him. And that's where we'll stop the story for today. That'll set us up on a cliffhanger for next week. Because Next week, and by the way, you say, well, I know what's going to happen. Well, if you read the story, you do. But you're like, all gets better. It's not exactly that clear. It's wild. It's kind of cool. Some really bizarre, fun things happen along the way. It's a little scary at moments. It all will take place next Sunday. Next Sunday, we'll wrap up Esther. Next Sunday, we'll wrap up the Old Testament. It's been a long journey. For today, I wanted to stop somewhere because I could not do this all in 1 week. I thought this was a good spot to stop because Esther's in a tough spot. And I know for some of us, we know how the story ends, or maybe you just assume because it's an old story, it'll end okay. But Esther doesn't know it's going to end okay. She's ready to die. If I must die, I must die. Mordecai doesn't know it's going to end okay. And maybe for some of us, you're in a spot in your life where you don't know how things are going to work out for you right now. You're going through some things and you don't know how it's going to turn out. You have no idea what the future holds, and you're not sure what to do. And maybe for some of us, we feel there's something that we ought to do. There's something that we should do about that situation, or maybe about something completely different. And we know what's right, and so our faith informs us of what's best to do. If there's a God and he's there and he cares, I should do the right thing. But we have doubt about how it's all going to work out. How do you step out in faith? The book of Esther never mentions the name God. Did you know that? It's the only book in the Bible collection that doesn't ever mention God by name. Never one time. But the implication is obviously there at the undercurrent of the divine hand of providence, right? Even without being spoken. That's what faith is. Faith, when we talk about faith at all, faith to do the right thing, there's always the implication about faith that there's a trust in a higher power. There's a God who's behind it all, who we're trusting that doing the right thing matters. And if you're called to do something that's hard or walk through a tough season of life or do the right thing and you're not sure how it's going to turn out for you, that's how Esther felt right here. But what does it mean to step out in faith? What does it mean to have faith? Well, people have spent years trying to define faith. Faith has been defined, the book of Hebrews says faith is the substance of things that are hoped for, it's the evidence of things that are unseen. Lots of good definitions for faith. I want to give you one that I've heard much of my life that has been a light to my path, a lamp to my feet. It's a really good definition of faith. I want you to write it down or take a picture of it. I'm going to give it to you in 3 pieces. Are you ready? What is faith? Faith is believing. I believe that there's a God, you're there and you care, God. I don't know how it's going to work out, but I believe that. I believe this is the right thing for me to do. I believe that I should do this. I believe I should step out. I believe someone has to do something right here, and it's scary, but I believe I should step out. I believe I should be honest, even though it might turn out bad for me. I believe I should be ethical, though it might go bad. I believe this is the right thing to do in my circumstance or how to face my situation. Faith is believing. But that's not all. Faith is believing and doubting. Faith is believing and doubting. Listen, don't let anyone tell you that there is no doubt in faith. There's always doubt in faith. Hear me? There's always doubt in faith. If there was no doubt, it would not be faith. It would be certainty. Are you with me? Are you following? If there was no doubt, it would be certainty. It would not be faith. If there was no doubt, it would be knowledge, not faith. Faith is believing and doubting. Look, if you ever sit around in a bunch of a faith community and you think, I don't fit in here because I don't have a strong faith like all these other people because I have my doubts. Oh, believe me, we're all in the same boat. Anyone who ever tries to tell you that they have no doubts about anything in perfect faith, they're either trying to impress you and get somewhere, or they really are very unaware of their own beliefs and haven't thought things through very well yet, and I don't trust them right there, I'll be honest. Because anything you're called to do, it includes believing and doubting. If you didn't doubt, it wouldn't be faith. It would be certainty. It would be knowledge. I have no questions. It's when you say, I know I should do the right, I know being honest is the right thing to do. I believe that I should do the right thing, but it might cost me my opportunity, and I doubt it will work out for me. I believe in doing this, but I doubt it will turn out the way I hope it does. I believe there's a God, but I doubt that he'll pay attention to my situation and come through for me. Faith is believing and doubting, but acting on the belief, and that's the key to the whole thing right there. The key is that whenever every decision and choice that you and I ever make, we have to decide, do we act on our belief or do we act on our doubt? Are you with me? We either act on our belief or we act on our doubt. Every time. Every time we get to decide, I believe this is right, so I'm going to do it, or I doubt it will turn out the way I hope it will, so I'm going to make this other plan because of my doubts. And when we act on our doubt, that's not acting in faith. Faith has doubt, but faith is acting on the belief rather than acting on the doubt. So what are you called to do today? What are you walking through today? What are you facing? Do you have belief about what's right and who God is there and all the things? Or do you have doubt? If you do, you're normal. We all do. That's what faith includes. But faith is when you act on the belief rather than acting on the doubt. And I hope that someone today finds direction through your circumstance because of that thought right there. Because I want these stories to be, I love the stories. They're great stories. I want us to learn them. I want it to be informational, as I often say, but I want it to be inspirational too. What do we do with it? Act on the belief, not the doubt. Next week we'll finish Esther and the Old Testament. Let's pray.